After my mom's new boyfriend pushed me out, she didn't hesitate to do the same. For years, there had been silence between us, no words of apology or even an explanation. 5 years have passed since I last saw my mom. I was 20 when she chose him over me, kicking me out to make room for him in her life. It all started with Rick, her ex-boyfriend at the time. He was the kind of guy who wore his intentions on his sleeve. He was a gold digger, and the worst part? He didn't even try to hide it. My mom had been seeing him for a few months before introducing him to me, and, incredibly, she didn't even think to mention that she had a daughter. It wasn't a casual oversight, it was a total disregard for my existence. Back then, my mom was 45, but she'd never let anyone know her real age. She told everyone she was no older than 40. A ridiculous lie, but one she pulled off with fillers and Botox. As for Rick, I wasn't sure how old he was exactly, probably in his early to mid-30s, but he wasn't too far off from her. He was moderately attractive, I'll admit that, and when they first started dating, I thought they looked like a good match. But that's before I heard him talk. The moment he opened his mouth, it all made sense. He didn't care about my mom's personality or who she was as a person. No, he was enamored with her wealth. He bragged about how impressive it was that she was a strong, independent, rich woman, as if that's what truly made her special. But if I'm being honest, it wasn't her strength or independence that he was after. It was her money, her house, her spacious living room, the obvious signs of wealth. That's what made her attractive to him. The truth was, my mom's wealth wasn't earned. She inherited it from her parents, who built up a company from nothing. After they passed away, it went to my uncle, who ran it. She never once cared to take over or learn the ropes. She didn't even care to keep herself occupied with anything meaningful. She had no career of her own. Her entire existence seemed focused on spending the money she had inherited, and that was it. I often wondered, was she ever truly independent? Or was she simply filling a void with money and distractions? She didn't care about motherhood, it was just another thing she had to do to pass the time. I sometimes think I was just a result of her boredom. Had she been in a different mood, I might not even have been born. Somehow, though, I was lucky. Not because of her, but because of my grandparents. They were decent people, and they stepped in when she didn't. She left me with them more than once, really, because she was too busy with her own life. My grandparents raised me, and for that, I'll be forever grateful. I never even knew who my father was. My mom got pregnant after a one-night stand, and she didn't even try to find him. As far as I knew, it was just me and my grandparents. And for a long time, that was enough. I had no complaints. But then came the loss, the heartbreak. My grandma passed away when I was in my junior year of high school, and just a couple of years later, my grandfather followed. It felt like I lost everything in a blink. Thankfully, my uncle was still around. He wasn't as close as my grandparents had been, and we didn't talk often, but he told me he'd be there for me. And for once, he lived up to it. I hadn't always lived with my grandparents, my mom was still in the picture. But she wasn't ever really there. She had a life, a busy social calendar. So, when I came home from school, it was just me. Alone in that big house. It didn't bother me, though. It gave me space to do my homework, to have some peace. After my grandparents passed, I moved into a college dorm. But I still made an effort to visit home once a month, especially for the holidays. It wasn't because I wanted to reconnect with my mom, though. It was just about the comfort of being in my own space. And when I did visit, I did it out of obligation more than a desire to be close. My mom hadn't changed. She was still the same shallow, self-absorbed woman she'd always been. Her relationships never lasted either. Sometimes the guys she dated were insecure, unable to handle her attention-seeking lifestyle. Other times, she simply got bored. She dumped them without a second thought, uncaring about their feelings. It was always the same pattern, and after each breakup, I was left watching it unfold. I could hear every word of their yelling from my room, my door barely closed, just above the living room. The screaming, the shouting, it was a constant. My mother never cared enough to make anyone stay, not really. But this time, it was different. With Rick, everything felt unpredictable. And the fact that she couldn't see what was right in front of her face, him being a gold digger, was almost laughable. She'd always been so good at spotting that sort of thing, but not with him. No, she missed it entirely. When my mother first introduced him to me, I was caught off guard. She had been dating Rick for just 3 months, and he'd never once heard about me. She'd kept that part of her life, me, hidden. I greeted him out of politeness, unsure what to expect. He looked at me like I was some sort of unexpected nuisance. Only then did my mother tell him, "This is my daughter." He seemed thrown off for a moment. Maybe it was the last thing he wanted. But that confusion vanished quickly, replaced by his charming grin. From the moment he spoke, it was clear. He was after one thing, money. I could see right through him. He didn't care about my mother. He was just looking for a payday. Dinner felt like a show he was putting on, flattering her, feeding her ego. He went on and on about how amazing it was that my mother was so independent, so strong. The way he emphasized her wealth made it clear he wasn't just in it for her company. No, he was in it for the luxury. It was embarrassing how obvious it was. After dinner, my mother told me Rick would be staying with us for a few weeks. Apparently, he had been laid off, and his landlord was about to evict him. Suddenly, everything made sense. He wasn't here because he liked her. He was here because he needed a roof over his head, and my mom was the perfect ticket. I wanted to warn her, but what was the point? We didn't have that kind of relationship, one where I could just tell her what I thought. I didn't say a word. Maybe I wanted to give him a chance, even though deep down, I knew I shouldn't. Time passed. A month later, I came back home, expecting the same old house, the same old routine. But when I walked through the door, the difference was glaring. Rick had practically moved in. The house had become his personal bachelor pad, and my mother didn't seem to care. She told me not to worry, that the housekeeper would handle everything, but the mess? That was a red flag. It was so unlike her. She was always a neat freak, but now? She was letting it slide. I didn't say anything, though. It wasn't my place. Rick and I barely interacted that weekend. I kept to my room, staying out of the way, as I always did when I came back home. I didn't want to be there, but I didn't have much choice. I only stayed for a couple of days, and I wasn't about to engage in anything more than the bare minimum. I didn't even speak to Rick once. So, imagine my surprise when my mother walked into my room on the day I was supposed to leave. She said we needed to talk. What could it possibly be about? We rarely had conversations, let alone important ones. But there she was, telling me that Rick wasn't comfortable with me being there. He didn't want me to come back next time. Apparently, I'd ruined the vibe. He liked the idea of the two of them, alone, and I had disrupted that by showing up. The audacity! He was acting like my presence in my own home was a problem. He didn't want a family vibe, he just wanted to be left alone with my mother, the gold mine. I was furious. He didn't belong here, and it wasn't even his place to decide. So I asked, "When's he leaving?" I needed to know. He was only supposed to be here for a couple of weeks, after all. But my mother just snapped at me, telling me it was none of my business. "It's my house," she said. "You're an adult now. You need to leave. Rick's serious about this. If he says you have to go, then you have to go." It was painful, like a slap in the face. But I didn't fight it. I knew better. There was no point. I did tell her, though, that Rick was nothing but a gold digger, and that she would regret this. She didn't care. And so, I packed my things. That was the end of that chapter. Months before Christmas, I packed up my belongings, leaving behind everything I knew. I didn't go back home, not because I didn't have a place to stay, but because, quite frankly, that place wasn't home anymore. When the winter break came, the dorms shut down, and students were expected to find somewhere else to go. That's when I turned to my uncle. It felt strange, awkward, even. We had kept in touch over the years, but we weren't close. So, reaching out to him for help wasn't something I ever thought I'd have to do. But what choice did I have? The dorms were closing, and I had nowhere else to go. My grandparents had set up a college fund for me, which took care of all the expenses, but they hadn't foreseen this situation. When I called my uncle, I could sense hesitation in his voice. But then, after a brief pause, he offered me a place to stay. He said I could live with him and his family for a while. The relief I felt was overwhelming, and I've been grateful to him ever since. I couldn't believe he was opening up his home to me, especially since we had always been so distant. He made me feel welcome, like I was finally part of a family again. It was then that he explained why we hadn't really connected before. It wasn't because he didn't want to, it was because of my mother. The two of them had never gotten along, and he always feared that trying to build a relationship with me would only cause more tension. He told me he didn't want to add to the drama, so he stayed away. But now that my mother had kicked me out, he felt it was time to step in. I'll never forget that heart-to-heart conversation. Since then, he and his wife have been the family I never had. His wife is the sweetest woman I've ever known, and his children? They've become the brothers I never had. From that Christmas on, I spent more and more time with my uncle's family. They embraced me, and it wasn't long before I became an integral part of their lives. After I graduated from college and found myself in need of a place to stay until I could get on my feet, I discovered that my mother and Rick, the man she had chosen over me, had broken up. I didn't know the specifics, but it didn't take long for the rumors to reach me. It was said that Rick had cheated on her. It was almost laughable when I thought about it. She'd kicked me out, hoping for a better life with him, and it all came crumbling down. But no, my mother didn't reach out to apologize. Not that I was waiting for it. In fact, I was relieved she didn't. We were done, and I had no desire to reconnect. My uncle, on the other hand, had become my anchor. He was the family I had never realized I needed. My grandparents were gone, and with them, any sense of security I once had. Now, my uncle and his family were all that mattered. Years have passed since then. A lot has changed, and yet, my relationship with my mother remains frozen in time. I married John 2 years ago. We met at a job I had right after graduation. It was meant to be a short-term position, but here we are, 2 years later, with a beautiful daughter. She's just a few months old, and already, I can't imagine my life without her. She's everything to me. And yet, in my excitement, I made a mistake. A big one. I posted about my pregnancy on social media. I'd kept it quiet before, just John, my uncle, and a few close friends knew. I never liked the idea of putting my life on display. I've always believed in protecting my peace, wary of the negative energy that can come with sharing too much. But after my daughter was born, the urge to share her with the world was too strong to resist. That was my first mistake. It wasn't long before my mother found out, and with that, she finally reached out. After years of silence, she sent me an email. In it, she told me that a few family members had shared the news about my baby. She said she was desperate to meet her granddaughter, that she couldn't wait any longer. I read the email in disbelief. The first thing I did was search for an apology, some sign that she regretted what had happened. But there was nothing. Instead, she went on and on about how difficult her life had been since her breakup with Rick. How the wounds from that toxic relationship still affected her, how she was struggling with loneliness. She talked about how all her old friends had moved on, how they had families or hobbies, while she had nothing. She begged me to let her back into my life. She claimed she couldn't do this anymore, that being alone was too much to bear. She needed me to accept her back, to make her feel like part of the family again. The email was sad, I'll admit. But it didn't soften me. It didn't break the walls I had built around myself. I had made the decision years ago, the day she kicked me out in favor of a man who didn't even stick around. That decision had been made for me, and nothing was going to change that now. I wasn't going to let her back into my life just because she was lonely. She had 25 years to build a relationship with me, to make me feel like her daughter. But she hadn't. She was too busy with her own life, and now, so was I. I had my own family, my own responsibilities. She had never treated me as her daughter, so why should I treat her like my mother now? And yet, the email kept coming back to me. Her misery, her loneliness. She didn't even think to apologize for what she did. She talked for pages about her own suffering but never once acknowledged how much she had hurt me. How much it had crushed me to be treated as an afterthought in her life. I was lucky, I suppose. I had my uncle, my aunt, and their children. They became my family. But my mother? She was a stranger to me, and that email only reminded me of why I had shut her out in the first place. Growing up, I had my grandparents who showered me with love and an uncle who tried to look out for me. But no matter how much they cared, it couldn't replace the void left by my mother's absence. For years, I wrestled with the feeling of not being enough for her. I questioned what I had done wrong, why I couldn't win her over. It wasn't until I hit middle school that the truth finally hit me. It wasn't me, it was her. Yet, those years, those lost years, could never be regained. And I was left with the haunting question, why did she even have me if she wasn't going to care? No apology was ever offered. Still, I told myself I could live with that. But what hurt the most was that she didn't even feel the need to apologize for abandoning me, for kicking me out of her house. She knew how difficult it would be for me, how alone I'd be without close family. My uncle wasn't someone I could turn to back then, and my grandparents were long gone. But to her, none of that mattered. It was only about her and Rick, their life, their happiness. Nothing else. Then came the email. All the years of anger, frustration, and confusion bubbled up to the surface like a storm ready to burst. I couldn't just let it slide. No. Instead, I opened up, pouring all the hurt and rage into a message that I knew would sting. And it was brutal. I called her every name I could think of, telling her how unfit she was, not just as a mother, but as a person. I told her I'd rather have been an orphan than be her child, that she was shallow, selfish, just like Rick. Two narcissists who deserved each other. I made it clear that I didn't want her anywhere near my life, that I would never allow her to meet my family. Blood might make us related, but that's all we were, nothing more. I hit send, and the weight of those words settled over me. I knew it would hurt her, but I didn't care. It was her turn to feel the consequences of all her neglect. Within hours, her response landed in my inbox. And, just as I expected, she didn't see it the way I did. She told me that if I was truly so angry, I shouldn't have even responded to her at all. She said that this was her attempt to fix things, to be part of my life again. But instead of appreciating her reaching out, I chose to tear her down. Reading her words, I felt something shift within me. Guilt. She was old now, alone. The reality of that hit me hard. Maybe I had been too harsh. The words I chose were cruel, and as I reread the email, I regretted every foul-mouthed sentence. I knew she was hurting, too, but how could I apologize without seeming weak, without giving her the wrong idea? After talking it over with John, though, I realized something. She didn't deserve an apology from me, not yet. She had hurt me for so many years, and now, after all that time, she wanted to waltz back into my life because she was lonely? It wasn't fair. Not to me. Not to my daughter. And what stung more was that she hadn't even offered a single word of apology for her past actions. I was done. She could keep sending her nasty emails, but I had moved on. They went straight to spam. I wasn't engaging with her drama anymore. I had a daughter who needed me, and that's where my focus was, on her. I wasn't going to waste time trying to prove anything to my mother. But just when I thought I had peace, the doorbell rang. I didn't even think twice about it, assuming it was John coming home. I opened the door, and there she was. My mother. Standing on my doorstep as if nothing had happened. I was taken off guard, but I wasn't about to let her in. With every ounce of strength I had, I slammed the door in her face. She was furious, screaming at me, calling me ungrateful. But I didn't care. I had nothing left to say to her. I wasn't going to be polite. I wasn't going to let her back in. Then, in a moment of madness, she threw a rock through my window. Just like that, a piece of glass shattered, but at least nobody got hurt. My daughter was safely in her nursery, and I was alone at the door. It could have been worse. I immediately called the cops, pressing charges. Now, things were escalating. This wasn't just some petty argument. She had crossed a line, and John and I had made up our minds. We were getting a restraining order. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about protecting my family. We spoke to my uncle, too, making sure he understood the seriousness of the situation and ramping up security. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Weeks later, the legal consequences caught up with her. She was given 6 months of community service and had to pay a fine for the damages she caused. But it wasn't just the fine that mattered. She had to pay us, too. The money didn't bring back what she had taken from me, but it was something. Looking back, I know she only avoided jail time because of her connections, her lawyer, someone who was more interested in saving her than admitting what she had done. But honestly, that's not my problem. What mattered was that she was held accountable. We had our restraining order. And for now, that was enough. John and I had been planning to move to a bigger house anyway, and now, with all of this behind us, we knew it was time. The only thing I cared about now was the future, my family. It's just going to be us, and for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. Wish us luck, because we're going to need it.